I'm from Huntingdon, which is in Cambridgeshire. Lived there most of my life. I came to Derby to come to treatment once I reached that point of desperation where enough was enough. After, 20 years of drug use, mostly cocaine, but stimulants generally, ecstasy, amphetamines, stuff like that. My use progressed much later. I started quite late. I was in my 20s really before it kicked off for me. Ecstasy was my first thing. I was working in pubs in Stoke-on-Trent, just up the road, and that's when it really kicked off for me. And then even then, I had periods of time when I wasn't using and I was relatively clean. But what I've discovered and what I'm conscious of is this is about my journey and what I've discovered and what I've learned through going through the various places I've been through, like the support services and NA and things like that, is I've learned that it's not about the drugs necessarily for me, it's about my behaviour. I didn't learn that stuff until I came into recovery. I always thought it was just about drugs, or even a specific drug, and then when I changed drugs, to try and manage it, that never worked, because I just had this inability to function or to live in society. What I see as, and I hate to use the word normal, but it's the best word I can come up with, people that go to work and they pay the bills and they look after their children and they have friendships and they can go and have a meal in a pub without getting smashed all the time, or they can go into a nightclub and things like that. I was unable to do any of that stuff without having drugs in my system. And for me, I was painfully shy right to my childhood. I remember, I talk about fear a lot with people that I know in recovery, and that's where a lot of our addiction is based. It's in fear, and I remember that fear being in my life from a very early age. I remember my first day at primary school like it was yesterday. I just remember being struck by this god-awful fear, and I was the child just like them, but I was just full of this fear, and that fear went all the way through my childhood, all the way through my teenage years, and it's been all there in my adult life. And it stopped me from achieving anything. I've always had this sort of belief in my abilities, but that fear, that lack of confidence, all that sort of stuff stopped me from achieving anything. And as a result, I used drugs, and then it becomes about how am I going to get drugs? How am I going to use? How am I going to fund this? Now, I worked for a lot of my addiction, up until probably 2008, I think. So I was quite fortunate's the right word, but I was able to fund a lot of it. But once that work stopped, I started having to rob and steal, and the lying and the manipulation and stuff like that increased. And as a result, I pushed my family and my friends further and further away, and they were never close anyway, because even before I started taking drugs, I used to steal a lot and lie a lot and stuff like that. I seemed to have this inability. If someone asked me a question, it's just this compulsiveness to lie, even if it was something really simple. So that's why I believe, addiction it's more than about drugs. It's a life problem. It's something that's wrong with me. Something's missing within me, and I was constantly chasing something. For a long time, I thought it was just the drugs, and I tried to put the drugs down, and I had periods of abstinence. But I was always filling that with something else, whether it was a relationship, whether it was work, whether it was some voluntary work, whether it was doing some education. There was always something else for me to focus on. My final straw really was when I was done for benefit fraud. And I ended up in court, and I was told I was lucky not to go to prison. I got conditional discharge. And that was sort of the final straw for me. I was isolating a lot, I was hiding away a lot. From life and people and everything else, and it got really, really bad. And I remember one of the things I try to remember how desperate I was and how bad things got. And one day I remember specifically was I was in my flat. I had no heating, I had no electric, I had no food. I'd spent all the money on drugs, and I was laying on my couch in a sleeping bag. It was winter, it was freezing cold, and all I had for heat was like one of those portable camp heaters. And I think about those sort of days, and it was awful. That's no sort of life for anybody. It's dreadful. And And I always, you know, when I started to realise I had a problem, I actually started to seek help from the NHS initially. I mean, I was already on medication for depression and stuff, but I was convinced it was more than that. So I had things like psychological assessments and all that sort of thing, and they said there was clearly something wrong. You know, I had zero self-esteem, zero confidence, I was scared of people, I had panic attacks, I was anxious. They couldn't put a label on it because the spectrum for mental health diseases is so wide. And then I just happened, and once again, this is my journey. I was on Facebook and I read something from somebody that was in my year at school. I didn't know her particularly, but I read something, and I took out of it that she had a drug problem, and she was working on it and focusing on it. Her life had changed, and she talked about she'd lost her kids and all this sort of stuff, and she was just getting the kids back in her life. So I sent her an email. I said, you know, how did this happen? And that's where I first started to look at my problem as a mental health issue, as an addiction issue, not just with drugs, but you know, with the other things, with that fear and all that sort of stuff. And that was what introduced me to NA initially. That was my initial sort of foray into self-help and support. It was 12-step treatment centre. They gave us a lot. We work on a set of principles and things like that, and we look at ourselves, and one of the first things is to admit we've got a problem, and then to seek that help. And they're fantastic. You know, it's not run by the NHS or anything like that. It's funded by some Benedictine monks in Scotland, but it's fantastic. What they do is fantastic. So yeah, and then that took me to about 8 months in treatment, and I learned a lot in that period. I did a lot of work on myself, and I came out, and quite quickly it was apparent, the change was apparent. When I got my first assessment for treatment, I couldn't do it. I could not get on a train and complete the journey to Derby to come for my first assessment. I was lucky in that I managed to get someone to bring me. And I say that because today things are different, and it's important. Somebody told me that for me to talk about and share my journey, I need to talk about where I was and where I am now, you know. And today I can get on a train. I get on a train and go home and see my son. It's a 3-hour journey, or I can get on a bus. More often than not, I can walk into a room with strange people like today, or even sit in front of a camera without too much hassle. I found I can cope, I can live, but I need to never forget where I came from, and that I'm an addict, and I will always be an addict, and I will always have some of those fears and some of those things, and I need to keep people close to me, the right people, the people that offer me that support, and it sounds really cheesy, but love, something I never had, something I was never able to accept or give. You know, and I found I'm very capable. I'm more confident than ever realised. So I came into New Futures at that point, and they were massive, because I was struggling with certain things in the rooms of NA, and it was all nothing to do with them. It was about my fear of being judged and all that sort of stuff. So I came into somewhere where I felt, and straight away I felt comfortable, and I felt able to talk about all this stuff that was going on where I wasn't able to talk about in other places. And that was great. And initially it was that support. I came into a couple of groups, talked about what was going on for me, and then that moved on. Did some abstinence matters stuff where we talk about some of the tools that we use in our recovery. And now there's a lot of service user involvement in New Futures. We have a couple of things going on. We have a service user forum. We meet once a month and we talk about the service and what's going on. We have an activities group where a group of us meet up once a week and we sit down and we plan and look at activities that we can do, and we've done surveys for what people want to do, because we realise that when somebody puts drugs down, they need to remove themselves from those social environments they're in. And then they're sort of left with, you know, what am I left with? I don't want to be sat at home in my flat. So we try to do things where we can get those people together to make new friends and try new things out and stuff like that. Recovery for me means change, progression. It means learning. Because like I said earlier on, I had this inability to learn, and I talk about it a lot, that I've it's another NA thing. I've grown up in recovery. A lot of the things I learned today, the way I learned to function, the way I learned to treat people, to deal with people. So for me, it's about progression. It's about a journey. It's not an event. It's not right. This has happened. That's it. I can go off. I will always be an addict. I know there are lots of people around me that have this particular problem. I always thought I was too old for recovery. You know, I turned 40 this year. But the truth is that no matter what age you get recovery, you've then got the rest of your life in recovery. Whether you're 40, 50, 60. And I would much rather have that than the life I had before. There's a friend of mine that says, I'm going to say this and he'll love it if he ever sees it, is the good thing about recovery is you get feelings back. The bad thing about recovery is that you get your feelings back. Any fear that anybody has that's at the beginning of that journey about what's going to happen, and any pain they may go through, particularly with physical withdrawals like rattles and stuff like that and detoxes, is only short, and it will pass and it will become a distant memory. And there is a life beyond what people are currently going through. There's a lot of people out there that have had a journey, that have got something to give. That's the one thing that's important for me. I said earlier on about that identification, but about seeing that other people have been through similar stuff and that they've been clean for 5, 6, 7 years, that they're successfully working, that they have families, that they're bringing up children, they're doing all that sort of stuff. All that stuff is possible. And that, for me, it's as simple as not picking up drugs every day. Do you know what? At the minute, I'm looking. I'm doing some courses. I'm involved in some peer mentoring stuff through New Futures. The next 6 months is about getting that experience, doing some college courses, and then hopefully, sort of mid next year, start looking at employment opportunities. That's something I never thought possible.